On the matter of the banana and other lessons from the hills. There is a misguided school of thought that selection builds character. There is another, that it chooses for character. The two are not always related. The early walks across gorse-spattered hills are timed. This is known before you go. In the abstract way that a man who has never been shot knows that bullets are unpleasant, technically correct, operationally useless. What you do not know until you are several hours into it with a Bergen that has developed a personal grudge against you and thighs that have filed a formal complaint with the management is the specific quality of the suffering. It is not dramatic. It is not the clean, telegenic agony of a man who has pushed himself to the edge of his limits and prevailed. It is, rather, more like being slowly informed by every major muscle group in turn that they are putting down their tools and going home, and that you should have started training in a different decade. I was, on this particular morning, somewhat behind the pace. This is a diplomatic construction. What I mean is that I had become the rearmost visible object on the hill, and there had been a period during which I was not entirely certain of my heading. Which is to say, I had made some navigational choices that were, in retrospect, wrong ones. The man who came back to check on me, I will call him Mackenzie, which was not his name, though it has the right texture, was a decent sort, the kind of solid, unflappable individual who finishes these things at the front and then doubles back on principle. Not because he's told to, but because he has a sufficiently developed conscience to feel bad about men being left behind on hills. He did not come back alone. There were 3 or 4 of them following his example, which, in retrospect, only compounded matters. Mackenzie, in short, was the sort of person I was not, that morning, performing as. The others were the sort of people who, under different circumstances, I might have been. He looked me over with the calm, diagnostic expression of a man who has found the thing he was expecting to find. And it was not a pleasant thing, and he was going to have to do something about it. He checked my vitals and my kit. He asked me some questions. I was surprised at first that he didn't appear to know what day it was until I realized this was some sort of diagnostic test of my own comprehensive ability. I believe I answered each question in the approximate vicinity of correctly, which, under the circumstances, was the best I could manage. And then, in the manner of a man who needed both hands free to continue his assessment, he held out a banana and asked me to hold it. This was a mistake. I ate it. I want to be clear that I understood, on some level, that this was not what had been intended. The man had a banana. The banana was his. He had given it to me on a temporary basis, in the way that one gives a person a coat to hold while one searches one's pockets, and the coat holder is not supposed to put the coat on and leave. But there is a state of moderate physical depletion in which the body simply processes the information differently. Banana, in hand. Banana, edible. Edible object. Body requires fuel. The sequence executed itself without meaningful intervention from whatever part of the brain is supposed to be managing things like social norms and other people's property. Id had prevailed over ego. It was a good banana. Ripe. He clearly had some regrets about his decision to entrust his banana to me, but was unsure how to proceed. The group laughed, and no doubt contemplated that no good deed really does go unpunished. I experienced the subsequent few seconds in a kind of slow motion, Mackenzie's expression moving through the stages of gastric interruptus grief, surprise, annoyance, something approaching resignation, then, ultimately, the particular crestfallen quality of a man who has watched his lunch disappear into a colleague and cannot decide whether to be angry or impressed. The others found it funny. Mackenzie, to his considerable credit, found it funny too eventually, though he arrived there a few beats after everyone else, and, I felt, somewhat reluctantly. Perhaps it was best he had brought an audience back with him after all, or I may not have made it off that hill. Mackenzie said nothing for a moment that was slightly longer than comfortable. Then he finished his assessment, confirmed I was not technically a casualty, and asked me if I were all right. It was a reasonable question under the circumstances, generous even. I have thought about it since, and I cannot fault his intentions. I had been disoriented, I had fallen behind, I had consumed his lunch without apparent awareness that I was doing so, and he wanted to know if I were all right. The honest answer, physiologically, was better than I had been 60 seconds ago. Instead of giving the fuller answer that his considerable empathy deserved, I simply said yes. While tactfully avoiding any description of the pleasant taste and feeling in my belly. We proceeded toward the finish line. I have thought about him occasionally since, not about what he thought of me, that I feel fairly confident about, but about the specific calculation a man makes when a stranger eats his banana on a hill. There is nothing to be said. The banana is gone. The man who ate it is still on his feet and has slightly more fuel than he had a moment ago. The only remaining question is whether this is someone worth continuing to help. Mackenzie had kept helping. This says something generous about his character. It says something else, probably, about mine. Around 3 years later, I found myself on the other side of the arrangement. Acting as enemy for a different course at an RAF base, I will describe only as existing. The exercise had 2 phases. In the first, we were to go outside the wire on patrol, with one of the DS leading us. We had been told there would be a student OP in the area, watching us, and that we should make enough noise and movement to give them something to report. This was the instruction. Give the students something to report. The DS evidently took this brief seriously. He was a smoker in the committed structural way that some men are smokers, not as a habit, but as a biological process, the way other men have a heartbeat. At intervals during the patrol, he would crouch low to the ground and produce a cough of such spectacular volume and duration that it ceased fairly early on to be distinguishable from a minor respiratory event. He did this at least 4 times. Whether he was providing the students with reportable activity or simply performing essential maintenance was not entirely clear. Possibly both. The distinction may not have mattered to him. At one point, having made a quantity of noise that would have been audible from the next grid square, he stepped slightly wrong on a slope, lost his footing, and went down it. Not a stumble, not a controlled descent. He went from vertical to horizontal and rolled, with a certain commitment, all the way to the bottom. He got up. The patrol continued. Nothing was said. Somewhere in the dark above us, a student OP was presumably writing all this down. If they had been briefed to expect anything, I doubt it was the emphysema branch of the Keystone Cops. But that is the thing about exercises. They prepare you for conditions you can anticipate. They are rather less useful for conditions you cannot. The second phase of the exercise was simpler. I was assigned to stand solitary stag at the fence line and be eliminated by the students on their infiltration and attack exercise. My colleagues formed the main target some way down the fence line from me. This was, in principle, a straightforward task. Stand in a place, be located, get killed on cue, allow learning to occur. I was standing exactly where I was supposed to be. I want to be clear about that, because what followed has occasionally been described by people who weren't there as some kind of elaborate tactical repositioning. And it wasn't. I was at my assigned post on the fence line. I had simply reasoned that the patrol, being students who considered themselves fractionally more cunning than the exercise required, would not come at me over the fence in front of me. They would be more likely to come over the fence on the other side of the perimeter, work across the interior of the base, and attempt to take me from the direction I wasn't watching. This would make them feel clever, which students enjoy feeling. It would also, if I remained facing outward in the approved direction, probably work. So I turned around, 180 degrees. That was the entirety of the tactical adjustment. I put my back to the fence, faced inward across the base, and waited. If they came over behind me, I reasoned, I would hear them on the wire. If they came across the interior as I suspected, I would see them first. Either way, I had a full magazine of blanks and nothing to do except stand in the dark and be correct about things. As it turns out, I was correct about things. A head appeared round the corner of a building at some 300 metres distance. It belonged to the DS who was leading the patrol in, and had the careful, exploratory quality of a man confirming a deduction before committing to it. Or perhaps merely confirming that nicotine, a treacherous rabbit hole, or gravity were not once again conspiring to derail his plans. What he found was me, in an orientation he had not anticipated. The head withdrew. There was a pause of perhaps 5 seconds, long enough for the deduction to be revised, a new decision to be reached, and an Insta-O group to be hastily convened and executed. Then he came around the corner at speed. The students behind him, committed now, in the manner of men who have decided that momentum is their only remaining argument, ran laterally towards my fellow enemy, who were still guarding their position about 400 metres up the way. As they passed, silhouetted by the now brighter lights of the base, they looked like those ducks you get at fairground shooting ranges. Bless them. I started towards them and emptied my magazine before the DS had covered half the distance toward me. The base alarm was not something anyone had specifically planned for. I had assumed someone had told the Rock Apes we were playing soldiers on the edge of their dominion, but apparently not. Blank fire at that volume, at that hour, on an RAF station, has a fairly deterministic relationship with the alert system. Everything lit up. The students, to their considerable credit, did not stop once they had crossed their line of departure. The element of surprise may have been gone. The sentry had evidently seen them coming, and the alarm was going off. But they sprinted for their primary target anyway, half a mile down the fence line where my colleagues were waiting, and put in the raid regardless. Blanks, flashbangs, the works. They did their job, I will say that for them. The fact that they were dressed like Pyra and Rock Apes with real rounds were on the way did not seem to enter their calculations. It was at this moment that I considered perhaps the yellow and white card rules were not solely for the protection of the enemy, but rather for over-enthusiastic students that didn't care if the jig was up. The fact they could not have succeeded against a real sentry in this scenario, because said sentry would not have been firing only blanks and they would not have reached the fence line, seemed like a churlish observation in the face of such bravery. I had to admire their spirit. As they hit the position, the explosions in the distance had a certain punctuation to them that I found, under the circumstances, satisfying. The DS hit me from the front in a rugby tackle at some considerable speed. We went down with as much momentum and violence as that leporine ankle trap and gravity had shown him on the patrol earlier in the day. As we tumbled, I experienced a certain visceral empathy with how the packet of fags in his pocket must have felt as they tumbled together down that slope. Which, to recap, he had most certainly done deliberately to give the students something to report, the selfless fellow. The alarm continued. We lay there for a moment in a jointly undignified heap, and then he looked at me and said, "Are you all right?" I immediately had a flashback to the day of the banana. It is possible he meant this physically. It is equally possible he was making a broader inquiry. Either way, it seemed only courteous to reassure him. "Not as good as you, apparently," I said. "I hadn't realised you were bulletproof." He did not immediately respond to this. Half a mile away, the flashbangs were still going off. Looking back now, there is something quintessentially British about asking a chap if he is all right after he has just eaten your banana, or blasted a magazine at your students for being too clever. Both Mackenzie and the DS meant well, I'm quite sure. Both were decent fellows with reasonable concerns, and on the available evidence, considerably more physical resilience than the situation strictly required of them. But it did leave me contemplating which is the better quality in a soldier, altruism or ruthlessness. I suppose it rather depends on whose banana is at stake.